Well, I propose that we start the session. We have 4 contributions, very interesting contributions. My name is Joost Walraven. I am former professor of concrete structures at Delft University of Technology and retired a few years and still active in research and things like the Model Code 2020. So I'm still busy with many things. The first contribution is an interesting one because it is dealing with assessment of existing structures indirectly, and directly it is the effect of corrosion on the behavior of concrete members. And the first presentation will be given by Hussein Nasser, and he is from Leuven University in Belgium. Please, Mr. Nasser, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone, again. Today I will present a part of my research project, which deals with corrosion damage in reinforced concrete. I will specifically talk about validation of a numerical model for corroded singly reinforced concrete beams. Before I start, I'd like to mention that my research project is a part of a larger project, which deals with different topics related to the assessment of corrosion damage in existing structures. Topics include acoustic emission monitoring of corrosion pullout behavior, experimental and numerical modeling of reinforced concrete beams, and structural reliability. For my part, I deal with the studies on experimental and numerical studies on reinforced corroded concrete beams. My presentation will be divided as follows. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about corrosion damage. I will give a brief discussion about the corrosion process and the damage which is formed due to it. After that, I will present my results of my experimental program. Afterwards, I will give a validation of a numerical model based on these experimental results. And finally, I will draw some conclusions. In reality, concrete is supposed to protect the steel from corrosion. However, if chlorides come in contact with the concrete and penetrate to reach the rebar, a corrosion reaction can initiate. This corrosion reaction leads to the formation of pits and corrosion products. The formation of pits will lead to a reduction in the rebar cross-section loss, while the corrosion products will penetrate into the pores of the concrete, causing radial pressure and eventually lead to cracking and spalling. This process also deteriorates the steel-concrete interface, leading to bond loss. Therefore, it is important to take into account the damage related to cross-section loss and bond loss in order to be able to predict the structural capacity of a corroded reinforced concrete beams. So the objective of the following presentation is to assess the choice of damage relations related to both the cross-section loss and the bond behavior on the prediction of a numerical model, which will be validated on experimental results. Before starting with the numerical results, I will first explain the experimental program. The experimental program consists of 2 parts. The first part is an accelerated corrosion experiment, where the beams reinforced with only 1 rebar and have the rebar diameter is 14 millimeters and the cover depth is 13 millimeters. The beams, as shown in the first figure, here are corroded upside down, meaning that the cover is at the top. A tank containing salt solution was glued to the cover using silicone, and a steel plate was put inside, was immersed inside the salt solution. Both the rebar and the steel inside the salt solution were connected to a power source so that the corrosion reaction can start. After the corrosion reaction started, formation of damage in terms of pits along the rebar and cracking parallel to the rebar occurred. 3 corrosion levels were targeted in this experimental program, namely 5%, 10%, and 15% of mass loss or cross-section loss of the steel. After the target corrosion level was reached, The beams were subjected to a 3-point bending test as shown in the setup to the right. During this bending test, the load was recorded using a load cell, while the deflections were recorded at midspan using LVDTs. Additionally, I applied the speckle pattern around the midspan so that I can monitor the evolution of cracks using digital image correlation. And this way I can obtain full load deflection curves, and I can also have an idea about the evolution of bending cracks. I will present first the results of non-corroded beams. I tested 3 beams, and the bending capacity, the average bending capacity was around 37 kilonewtons, as shown from the strain field obtained through DIC. Well, I only present 2 of the beams. The beams developed multiple flexural cracks that are closely spaced. If I would move now to the corroded beams, namely, I will discuss first those that have reached 5% mass loss of steel. It can clearly be seen that corrosion reduces the bending capacity and the stiffness of the beams. It's also noted that one of the beams, the curve which doesn't show a distinct yield point, have developed a splitting crack, which indicates bond failure due to bond deterioration. So not only does corrosion reduces the yield capacity, it also changes the failure mode from yielding to formation of splitting crack or debonding crack. If I would also move to higher corrosion levels, namely now the beams that reach 10% of corrosion, further reduction in the structure, in the bending capacity and stiffness can be observed. If we would look to the right to the GIC, to the strain maps obtained from GIC, a reduction in the cracking pattern is observed. Most beams showed 3 cracks, and the beam in the middle 10R2 showed 2 cracks and a severe formation of splitting crack, indicating as well the effect of bond deterioration. If I would also relate the bond deterioration to the load deflection curves of beam 10R2, the severe case of splitting, formation of splitting cracks is translated into a load deflection curve, which is the least stiff. Therefore, taking into account the bond deterioration is important to be able to predict properly the reduction in stiffness of corroded beams. Going to the beam that reached the highest corrosion level, it reached 13% of mass loss. The beam failed by yielding, but it didn't show formation of excessive splitting cracks. Therefore, it's possible that higher corrosion level doesn't necessarily mean a higher level of bond deterioration. Therefore, corrosion causes reduction in the bending capacity due to the formation of pits and the loss of cross-section loss of the steel. It also, due to bond deterioration, can cause a decrease in the number of cracks and the formation of splitting cracks. Both types of damage are necessary to be taken into account in a model. After discussing the experimental program, now I'm going to move to the numerical modeling, which will be validated on the load deflection curves and the DIC figure, the DIC results of the cracking patterns. The model was built in Diana using 2D plane stress elements. The average material properties related to the compressive strength was used, which was calculated from tests on cubes, while the characteristic uniaxial tensile strength was used. I used grade 500 steel, so I used the average values of that type of steel. As for the cracking model, I noticed that if I use a rotating crack model, the model would predict the formation of a shear crack, which was not observed in the experimental test, while a fixed crack model shows a more stable behavior of the cracking. I explained this by the fact that a fixed crack model includes a shear retention factor, which plays the role of aggregate interval and can actually stabilize the formation of shear crack, especially if those beams have no straps. So after introducing the model and the different material properties and the cracking models used, it can be seen that a good validation has been obtained. The validation was done on the load deflection curves of the non-corroded beams. And the numerical cracking pattern was also compared to the cracking pattern obtained from DIC, which show multiple cracks that are closely spaced. After validating the non-corroded beam, the corroded beams were modeled using reduction factors. The reduction will apply to the cross-section, the steel material properties, and the bond strength. In the following slides, I'll explain how these reduction factors, or damage models, let's call them, were chosen. The reduction of the steel cross-section was measured by extracting the steel from the concrete after the bending test and cutting it into pieces of 20 centimeters. In this way, I can obtain the variation in the cross-section loss, and I can also obtain the average cross-section loss of the full rebar. It's not enough to, let's say, know the cross-section loss, but corrosion also deteriorates the steel material properties, namely the yield strength, the tensile strength, and also the ultimate strain. I used the model from the literature with the reduction factors shown to the left. If I would justify the use of these reduction factors, I found that at some points along the rebar, the maximum cross-section loss reached is double of that of the average. Therefore, it predicts that if my average cross-section loss reaches 50%, then at certain location along the rebar, 100% cross-section loss is going to happen. Taking this into account and assuming that the maximum cross-section loss would determine the tensile strength and the yield strength of the rebar, the calibration factors of 0.019 and 0.018 correspond well to the fact that the slope of the decreasing curve predicted from the relation between the average and maximum cross-section loss is 0.02. Therefore, it's important to calibrate damage relations to reduce the material properties of steel based on the distribution of bits. Finally, I also took into account the bond deterioration. I assume in this figure here that when the concrete is not cracked, then the bond is not affected by the corrosion, whereas the moment surface corrosion cracking occurs, then a decreasing in the bond strength has been calibrated according to pull-out tests. The decreasing rate, -0.2, was obtained based on pull-out tests that have been done in the framework of the same project. After obtaining this curve, I can find the residual bond strength based on the average cross-section loss. And I can build the deterioration curves shown here based on the non-corroded curve. So if I would calculate, for example, the residual cross-section loss from the decreasing curve, I would correspond it to the point on the non-corroded curve, and I will build the deterioration curve based on, first of all, a linear increasing curve, and then a decreasing curve. This has been done for every corrosion level, and these were implemented in the model. I will now discuss 3 types of corrosion models. The first model takes into account only the average cross-section loss, the damage relations related to the steel material properties, and doesn't take into account the bond loss. It can be seen that a good agreement has been found for the high corrosion level, whereas for the lower corrosion levels, 5%, and the medium corrosion levels of 10%. If you remember previously, those those two levels I showed the formation of splitting cracks. A little bit of overestimation has been obtained, which can be due to the fact that in these models the bond deterioration has not been taken into account, which would affect the stiffness and also the capacity. In the second model, I try to discretize the bar into segments of 20 centimeters so that I can take into account variation in cross-section loss. It can be seen that for the high corrosion level, the relatively accepted numerical model is obtained. For the 10% beam, so the dotted red one, a good agreement has also been obtained. This beam has failed in yielding and did not show splitting cracks. So not taking into account the bond deterioration will not affect its results, while for the other beams, the ones shown here, do not agree well with the curves in orange, which showed splitting cracks. Therefore, it's important to take into account the bond deterioration in order to model the decrease in stiffness and the formation of splitting cracks. For the 5%, a better estimation has been obtained for the beam that showed a distinct yield point, but not for the one that showed a formation of splitting cracks. For the third model, I took into account the bond deterioration based on the calibrated curve, as I explained recently. A decrease in stiffness has been observed, which agrees well with the one in the experiments. Yet it was not observed, and splitting cracks were still not observed, especially in the case of the beam which shows the least stiff behavior and the most deterioration in terms of bond stiffness. It could be possible that in the calibrated bond slip curve, the slip which taken into account is too low, whereas for a beam to show excessive slip, then the calibrated deterioration curve should predict a bond failure at a higher slip value. Therefore, the use of a 2D beam model can predict the capacity of RC beams, and the use of the damage relations related to the cross-section loss should take into account the distribution of bits in order to calibrate such relations. And the model is able to predict the behavior to a certain degree of accuracy, yet the improvement of the model should take into account an improved bond model in order to capture splitting failure and the decrease in stiffness. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That there was some comment. The first one was from George Wadi. Thank you for your presentation. How much time the tank with the NaCl did stay on the beam before the test? And the second question, did you consider a bond slip behavior in your FE model? The question was raised already before, so I think you have partially already answered, but maybe you can give some comment.
So the first question regarding the salt solution, it was there glued to the beam during the whole corrosion process, because it's important because there's also a steel plate immersed in the beam. And yeah, the accelerated corrosion process would not happen if the salt solution is not available during the whole process.
Okay.
For the second question, yes, I took the bond slip
Yes.
curve into account, as I explained how I calibrated the deteriorated curve based on pull-out tests. But I believe that the slip value where the bond failure occurs should be higher than what's predicted. If we look in the literature, normally they would say that corrosion, because due to the formation of corrosion products, you would see in a deteriorated bond slip curve an initial increase in stiffness, and which also causes bond failure at a lower slip value. But seeing my beams that they show excessive slip of the reinforcement that led to splitting failure, so probably bond failure should happen at a higher slip value. But that's something to probably investigate more.
Okay, there is a second question from Professor Shekotsov, and he says, I don't clearly understand about the value of the tensile strength in comparison with the compressive strength 40 versus 2 in the numerical analysis. You could say, well, 2 is a little bit low for a concrete strength of 40. Can you give some comment on that?
Yeah, this is, I calculated that based on flexural tests on prisms. And afterwards, I calculated the characteristic uniaxial tensile strength from the flexural strength, and I got a value of 2. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, it was 2. So it's not based on cause. It's based on my concrete mix and flexural tests done in prisms.
But was it a result of calibration that you have tried to find the most the best prediction values?
No, it was based on flexural tests on 3 prisms.
Okay.
So I have my flexural tensile strength. After that, I calculated my uniaxial tensile strength, and I calculated then the characteristic uniaxial strength, which can make it lower. So actually, the result I get from my prisms is higher, but I chose the characteristic strength in order to model to get a better stiffness. If I would use the average value of my tensile strength, then the behavior in terms of stiffness would be higher, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that, well, there could be variation in the material model. There's always variation in the material properties.
Of course, yeah.
And my beam seems to agree more with the characteristic strength rather than the average value of the tensile strength.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have another question, and that is about the validity of the model, because you have used a system that you have increased the corrosion speed. So you have an accelerated corrosion speed.
That's true.
And the point is that you have a uniform weight loss over the length. That's also what you have shown in one of the diagrams. Read from left to right, the weight loss is about uniform. But that means that your model is valid for uniform corrosion and not to pitting corrosion. So it is, I think, perfect for carbonation-induced corrosion, but I think it is not immediately valid for chloride-induced corrosion.
I wouldn't call that type of corrosion uniform corrosion in the sense how it happens in carbonation, because as I showed, there's a certain, as I showed in the bar graph, there's a certain variation, but those are only based on segments of 20 centimeters. If I would even discretize more, I can observe that I can get to cross-section loss, so the maximum cross-section loss, which is actually double the average cross-section loss. So this is also an indication of the formation of pits and the variation of the cross-section loss. So I wouldn't say it is uniform.
No, it is not completely uniform, but it tends to be uniform. But if you have a large member and you have crack distances, then in chloride-induced corrosion you have pitting mostly in a crack.
Yeah, the pitting that's
different, because then you lose a little bit the relation between the weight loss and the bond.
It's true that the pitting is uniform, is spread out along the rebar, but there are places where the pit is deeper than other places. So it's not really uniform as it happens in carbonation. It is uniform because it's spread out over a large distance, but still there are variations in the depth of the pits. So there are locations where you find more deeper pits than actually other locations. And that's why I said that calibration of damage models should take into account these variations.
Okay. You have said that you have a number of specimens, and one of the characteristics is you call it R. That means you have ripped steel only.
Yeah, those are ripped steel.
Yeah. Are you planning to do tests with other types of steel?
I do have tests on smooth and I do already have some models, but for this, until I made this paper, I still didn't have all the results.
Okay.
But I already have results for smooth bars, bending,
Okay, that's
and
very
I'm also
interesting
calibrating
because,
models.
in existing structures, very often we have plain steel, so this is
Yeah,
very important to have them
that's
both.
true.
So
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, so I also will make models on for smooth bars.
I have a last question, and
Yeah.
that is you have made your calculations, your finite element calculations, and you found that the fixed method is the best. But I was wondering why your shear retention factor that you have selected is so low. It is very low. And I think these beams, they are slender, and the reinforcement ratio is small, so you will always expect bending failure. So I am wondering why you use such a very small value of beta in order to avoid shear, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted the model not to predict the formation of the shear fail as I was getting the rotating crack model. So I just used the default value of beta in Diana. It gave a good cracking pattern that agreed with the experimental results, and I was satisfied with the value, just based on the validating with the load deflection curves and the cracking pattern.
Yes. Are there any other questions?
We still have 2 questions in chat.
I'll open the chat to check it.
I see. Yeah.
I cannot see the chat, so wait.
Okay. There is one question on the shear retention factor.
Yeah.
Okay. What value of shear retention factor did you use? Why? How sensitive is the numerical results for the 3-point bending test to that factor? It's about the same question that I raised.
Yeah, I didn't test the sensitivity, but I used a value of 0.1, which is the default value. But I remember if I would increase the retention factor, the bending capacity would be overestimated. That's if I would remember. That's as I remember very well. So I stayed with the value beta equals 0.1 because it validated, it agreed well with the load deflection curves in terms of stiffness and yield bending capacity or yield point and the cracking behavior.
And then there is a question from Dr. Jean-Luc Clément. And he says, what are the limitations of the 2D modeling?
Limitations of a 2D modeling. Well,
because
now I'm only I did only experiment on a single reinforced concrete beam, so it would be interesting to see how would a 2D model behave with more complex or more beams reinforced with multiple rebars with, let's say, different corrosions. And it doesn't take, for example, shapes of pits into account or the geometry of pits, but I would say a 2D model is able to predict the behavior to a certain degree of accuracy.
Okay, I think we are at the end of the session because it's 10 o'clock. I would like to thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. We wish you the continuation of your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.